Ellert, we've received a question from one of the YouTube viewers asking when you say a patient gets better or healing, what do you have in mind?
In a very general sense, I would say that the point is to increase the patient's what we call power of action, power to act, to do things. That, of course, implies that we know what it is that the patient has to do. That means that we need an answer to the question what it takes to overcome trauma. And that presupposes that we have an answer to the question what trauma is. Well, let me start with the latter. What is trauma? Originally, it meant wound, and to me, it still means wound. It's an injury. Something happened to you and that has injured you physically, mentally, and since I do not believe that it is a wise thing to divide us in a physical part and a mental part, but to regard us as whole organisms, it's the whole organism actually that has become wounded. And since the organism is always embedded in a world, is part of a world, is not somehow in the world, but is part of the world, as I said, it's a whole ecological system. We are not having individuals and the world. We are ecological systems. The world is the way we feel it, we experience it, we see it, we understand it. And without us, there would be no world that anyone could say anything about. Thus, it's the ecological system that has become injured. Now, what's the injury? When we experience things, they have to become part of our life, in particular when they are significant, important to us. When they are significant in a negative way, we must still come to terms with it. It must become part of us. If not, as Janet would say, the action is not completed. We keep returning to it in nightmares, flashbacks, intruding voices. Thus, we have experienced something and it has not left us, but it's also not completely one with us. That means we must integrate what happened to us. Now, this, of course, begs the question what integration is. It's not very easy to give an answer to that one in a brief form, but basically we could say, I must be able to experience and say that what happened to me, that it happened, that it's not a thing that is ongoing. No, it's over. It's over and done with. But I cannot completely forget it or ignore it because what happened to me has consequences for my present and my future. Thus, I must embed the experience in the whole context of my life, but such that I do experience that it is a thing of the past, but to repeat myself with consequences for my future. That, in the end, we can indicate when we say that we have to realize what happened to us. Realized it happened to me, such and so was the case, it happened in the past, and it's a part of my life with consequences. Now, traumatized people typically have not been able to sufficiently engage in that complicated action. That's why it keeps returning. And because that which is returning is so utterly painful, we are, when we're in this situation, motivated to avoid it, to not know it, to ignore it. But we can't ignore it because it's part of us, even though we may not sort of recognize it as a part of us instantly or not fully. Thus, we have to engage in a number of actions so that we, in the end, can say, I've put an end to the whole thing. It's over. Now, having said that, the most important element in complex traumatization is, particularly when we speak about chronic traumatization by those people who are very important to us as we mature, say our parents, when we are abused, neglected, maltreated by our parents or other close family members, we are in a very difficult situation. On the one hand, we want to attach to them. On the other hand, we need to defend ourselves. I believe that, returning to this term ecological system, that the essence of us as ecological systems is that we long to be and become what we can be. We are longing and we strive to get what we want. We strive to avoid what we don't want, and we want to get rid of what harms us. Now, if we are being part of a family and we want to grow in the context of that family, we need to attach. It's not an option, it's obligatory, mandatory. Because we need to attach to those people who hurt us. And by our very nature, we attach, but by our very nature too, we defend. Now, what to do? Because the one goes against the other. Meaning that chronic traumatization by primary caretakers is a very, very complex thing, so to speak. Overcoming that conflict between the need to attach and the need to defend is, as I see it, the essence of the treatment of complex traumatization by caretakers. If we put things this way, trauma becomes a conflict. Is that an overstatement? Well, I don't think so. If we think of PTSD, the simplest form of dissociative disorders, as I see it, what do we have? On the one hand, there's the need to continue life. On the other hand, something horrible happened that I need to integrate and realize as part of my life. I'm not keen on doing that because it's hurting, so I try to get away from it. But the more I get away from it, the more also part of me is stuck in the horror and tries to get away from that. That's also in conflict. On the one hand, the longing and striving to ignore what happened. On the other hand, feeling fragile and having the need and the wish to become liberated from being in this very difficult situation. But that takes cooperation between these two positions, these two, call it parts of the self, or more precisely, parts of the ecological system. Things become even more complex when we realize that a child is not only having a longing to attach and a longing to defend, but also includes a longing to become independent, autonomous, a most important feature of every individual life. That's, phrased differently, a need for control. And how can I control myself if I do not have very good models to follow? If on the one hand, the family in which I'm being abused, maltreated, and neglected ignores the issue, which is typically the case, on the other hand is controlling me, not meeting me and my fragility. In these circumstances, a child can develop a third position, a third agent, as I would say. There's the agent trying to ignore and go on with daily life. There's the agent feeling fragile but stuck in the horror. And the third agent then is an agent that seeks autonomy, control. How to achieve that? Well, imitate the perpetrator, the ones who model for you what you must do and how you'd best act when you wish to be in control. Because now we get an opposition between three positions. I call them ignorance, fragility, and control.
So, how would you then define healing? Do they need to fuse together?
Well, in my clinical experience, when you consist of a group, a set of dissociative agents, yes, I've seen the best results in treatment for those patients who wish to and who can also, who are able to fully fuse these originally opposite agents. That does not mean that I, as a clinician, would say that that must happen. The patient does what she wants to do. If she doesn't want that fusion, fine. But that will also have certain consequences. In the end, of course, the choice is up to the patient.
You just said if she wishes to and can, what would be certain limitations?
Well, Since we are ecological systems, a part of our power depends on the kind of person, individual, organism we are. Another thing that defines how powerful I am, it depends on the powers working on me from the environment. If those powers are negative, not helpful, then it may become too difficult to engage in all those steps that are required to heal. Thus, there may be limitations to people's powers. Part of these powers depend on us, other parts of our power depend on our environment. And actually, they are entangled.
Would one of those powers be being in contact with the abusive parents?
Yes, that can help. I've seen patients who manage to speak to the formerly abusive caretakers and came to a sort of resolution. And that certainly helps to get the recognition from people, the acknowledgement, yes, I mistreated you, I abused you, I am the one who's responsible for that. That is tremendously relieving. On the other hand, in the large majority of cases, perpetrators don't feel like doing this. I've only seen it in exceptional cases. Thus, lacking that recognition must come from somewhere else. Now, that's not an easy thing either, because as we all know, the track record of psychiatry and trauma is not a very positive one. Psychiatry has always struggled with trauma and actually is still struggling with it. We see major changes, absolutely changes for the better, but that doesn't mean it's a simple thing. For example, to this very day, there are people who deny the existence of complex disorders such as dissociative identity disorder. Other people say it's just complex PTSD or it's borderline, or someone else said actually it's bipolar mood disorder. There's a continuous tendency in psychiatry that comes and goes, it comes in waves, but a tendency to deny the reality, the authenticity of a complex dissociative disorder.
Is it possible for a patient to fully fuse the different parts, even when the patient is still in contact with the family and that the family denies the existence of the childhood abuse?
I would say that in the case that you describe, that's only possible if the patient manages to acknowledge and accept that the family cannot acknowledge and accept or is not inclined to do that. The patient must, in that case, develop the power to act, to live with that reality. I've seen cases like that. For example, one of my patients, having become a whole, a former DID patient, having become a whole, wrote letters to her mother, not once, but repeatedly. And the mother was, so to speak, the main perpetrator. Mother never responded, did not wish to talk to her, did not respond to her letters. That created clearly a very difficult situation for the patient, but she managed to keep it up and say, somehow my mother is not willing and able to do it. There were indications that mother had been abused herself. Thus it might be that acknowledgement from the mother would have implied that mother's world would collapse. And this is what this particular patient sort of understood, or that was her interpretation at least. And she said, I must live with it. And she did it. In her case, she was wonderfully supported by her husband. He had sort of saved her from the family when she had become pregnant from her stepfather. She was only 15 at the time and gave birth to the child when she was 16. And she had a good marriage with her husband. And he was the kind of guy that you would want to have when you're DID. I met him, very kind, and he was very down to earth. And I said, well, was it easy to live with your wife? Well, come on, doctor, he said. What would you think? It was very difficult at times. How did you manage to do that? What was it like for you when she switched from one part to the next and back again? He said, well, I simply loved her. Because whatever she showed, he could still keep up his feeling of love for his wife. He was so down to earth, he could see through the pathology. In this case, we didn't need to discuss it. In another case, I've spoken with partners and helped them to understand their partners better, to see the problems and the backgrounds. And if they were willing and able to accept it, that made all the difference in the world. What I mean to say is, to heal, you don't need the whole world to accept you. It's not mandatory that the perpetrators accept and acknowledge you and take responsibility, even though that's a major help if they do. But doing it without any support, I think that's hardly possible. In some cases, it's the therapist who's the best contact. In quite a few cases in my career, I was that one for a longer time before the patient was able to develop healthier social relationships. Until that time, the therapist is of awful importance to the patient. That puts a high responsibility on us. It's not always easy. The patients are not always easy, so to speak, for us too. In these cases, the therapist may need supervision. The therapist may need support to keep up the positive relation with the patient. But it's doable, and when we succeed, it's magic, it's wonderful. It's a great pleasure to see how people who have been so deeply damaged, how they can heal. And I would wish that every clinician could experience that, because it really motivates us to keep ourselves going.
We've briefly touched upon full integration. Is that really necessary? Can a patient also heal on his or her own terms, not fully fusing the different parts?
Yes, I've seen several patients directly as a therapist and as a supervisor who can make major progress. But to repeat myself, full healing, full fusion in the end is more profitable. But there are circumstances in which that full fusion may not be achievable or wished for by the patient. I'm reminded of one patient, and she really wanted to integrate traumatic memories and then fuse. But even integrating traumatic memories did not work for her. She became totally confused time and again, even when we both tried very hard to help her with this. It didn't work. Later, it appeared that her mother, again a mother, had been very negatively interfering with this progress. And then we had to decide that we would not further try to help her integrate traumatic memories, but to try and help her live with her family as good as it could be. And it became a far better life, but it was not ideal.
And when you say we, who are the different people?
Here I'm also speaking about the family. Here we spoke to her children and her husband, and they too noticed that when we in therapy tried to do more than the patient was up to and her whole ecological reality allowed, that we got major drawbacks. We first acknowledged that that was the case, then we tried to understand together what seemed to be the reason. And then, even though the patient still continued having the wish to integrate more traumatic memories than she had been able to do, the family lived with this reality. In her case, I would guess that first mother had to either move or decease before further progress might be possible.